Hey, que la que hay, it's Rocky here, and today we will be doing a Puerto Rican Spanish exercise. We will be listening to an audio from my friend Hector from Puerto Rico. So I'm going to play the audio for you, and I'm going to provide you with both the transcription in Spanish and the translation. So take your time with it. Feel free to pause the video and play it back. After we listen to the audio, I will then point out a few aspects of the Spanish by giving my 3 biggest takeaways or tips when listening, so then you can go back and listen again and focus on the tips that I give. Then we will quickly cover some key vocabulary words and phrases that you can study. Sin más, comencemos.
Hola a todos, mi nombre es Héctor López y con motivo de que podamos practicar el español puertorriqueño voy a estar hablándoles un poco acerca de mí. Soy psicólogo, tengo una maestría en psicología clínica y también soy entrenador personal. Por lo general, ejerzo más de entrenador personal. Mi día a día comienza a las 5:30 de la mañana, hora que tiendo a levantarme. Desayuno, me lavo la boca, me baño y ya como a las 7:30 empiezo a entrenar a mis clientes de por la mañana. De las 7:30 de la mañana como hasta las 12 del mediodía. Luego de las 12 del mediodía, llego a mi casa, almuerzo, descanso un rato, me dedico a leer sobre temas que me gustan. Si tengo tiempo, pues luego de almorzar hago ejercicio para mantenerme en forma. Luego a las 2 de la tarde empiezo a entrenar a mis otros clientes, que los tengo divididos entre esos horarios. De 7:30 a 12 del mediodía y de 2 a 6 de la tarde. Luego de esas horas llego a casa, me baño, descanso un poco, como y me dedico a compartir con mi familia. Por lo general es una rutina en mi vida, el entrenar personas, el dedicarme a leer. Entre mis pasatiempos favoritos están el hacer ejercicio, como ya les mencioné, el leer, y pues mejorarme cada día, ya sea pues a través de la lectura, ya sea a través de tratar de desarrollar proyectos. Cuando no estoy haciendo esas cosas, pues actualmente estoy construyendo una oficina donde voy a ejercer como psicólogo, y eso es algo pues que me apasiona y que quisiera pues lograr pronto. Algo adicional que quiero compartir con ustedes es que la unión de mis profesiones, de la psicología y el entrenamiento personal, me ha permitido ayudar a las personas dentro de diferentes facetas, ya que sabemos que el ejercicio físico conlleva de un elemento de autoestima, de mantener motivación, del querer superarse. Y la psicología, pues me permite también obtener esas herramientas que me ayudan emocionalmente, poder estar ahí por mis clientes. A pesar de que mi función primordialmente con los clientes de entrenamiento personal es permitirles ayudarles a desarrollar su físico, ese lado de la psicología también me permite estar ahí para ellos, mantenerlos motivados, ayudarlos a lidiar con su estrés, con su ansiedad. Y pues es algo que me apasiona y me llena como persona.
Okay, so let's cover 3 keys that I want you to pay attention to, all right, when you go back and listen. First, his intonation. So the intonation is the flow of the way that somebody speaks. So the intonation and the pronunciation are the primary characteristics that distinguish a type of Spanish from another. Also, the certain words that people use is a distinguishing factor, but Hector uses common words in this dialogue, which is great because even though he was using more neutral words, you can still tell that he is Puerto Rican because of a few of the characteristics. Like I just said, number 1, the intonation, so the change in pitch. So when he says in the beginning, psicología clínica, psicología clínica,
Psicología clínica, psicología clínica.
Notice the pitch, all right? A more neutral reading of this would be psicología clínica, So what's unique to Caribbean types of Spanish, and specifically in this case, Puerto Rican Spanish, is the extreme rise and fall of the pitch within words. Another example of this is when he says, desayuno, me lavo la boca, me baño.
Desayuno, me lavo la boca, me baño.
So while you are listening to the audio, pay attention to the way that he speaks, the flow that he uses, also known as the intonation. This is something that you're going to want to mimic if you want to sound more Puerto Rican when you speak Spanish, if that's what you want to do. And not only Puerto Rican, but this works for any type of Spanish that you are trying to learn. All right, so pay attention to the intonation of the speakers because that's where the true sounding like a native comes from. It's a mixture of the intonation and the pronunciation. But I would say that intonation is how we tell a native from a non-native. For example, in English, my first language, I may pronounce words incorrectly or maybe differently from you. I may come across words that I'm just not familiar with. But you know that I'm a native speaker because of how fluid my speaking is and basically because my intonation is that of a native speaker. So we can try to reverse engineer this to sound more like a native Spanish speaker. Sure, we might mispronounce words every now and then. We may not know what a word means, but if we sound like how other natives sound, then we are much more likely to be viewed as a native speaker or at least as somebody that has an advanced level in Spanish. Now let's move to takeaway number 2, elimination of the S. Now this falls more in line with pronunciation. Remember, intonation plus pronunciation equals the type of Spanish being spoken. So in this case, when Hector says, cuando no estoy haciendo esa cosa,
Cuando no estoy haciendo esas cosas, cuando no estoy haciendo esas cosas,
it's easy to see that he doesn't say the S. But in Puerto Rican Spanish, oftentimes you don't just not hear the S, but you hear an H sound in exchange for that S. So it's not just cuando no estoy haciendo esa cosa, it's cuando no estoy haciendo esa cosa. You can kind of hear a little H sounds, very slight, but you can hear it a little bit, and you exchange that for the S. And also notice the intonation of just this phrase, esa cosa, cosa, esa cosa. So again, we see the combination of intonation and pronunciation. I know I keep hammering this, but it's extremely important if you really want to sound authentic when you speak. All right, now the next takeaway number 3, is putting words together. Now, many times people think that native Spanish speakers, especially Caribbean Spanish speakers, speak fast, and they do. But the real problem in understanding them isn't so much the speed, but the fact that they put words together. So an example of this is when Hector says, empiezo a entrenar.
empieza a entrenar, empieza a entrenar,
It sounds like empiezo a entrenar. And if we play the whole sentence,
empieza a entrenar a mis clientes de por la mañana.
it's like empieza a entrenar a mi cliente de por la mañana, de por la mañana, de por la mañana, de por la mañana. De por la is like one word, right? It sounds like one word. De por la, but it's de por la. De por la. So when you are listening to Spanish of any kind, focus on the sounds and notice how the words get chunked together. Now that I've shown you these things, now that you've heard them, you won't be able to unhear them. So your listening skills, they're automatically going to improve. It's like magic. Now let's go over some key vocabulary words and phrases that I want you to write down. Keep in mind, you can write down more than these 10, but don't write down too many. I recommend only writing down 10 to 20 new phrases per day because our brains can only process so much new information at once. So we have una maestría en psicología clínica, master's degree in clinical psychology, tiendo a levantarme, I tend to wake up, empiezo a entrenar, I start to train, descanso un rato, I rest for a while, entre esos horarios, between those schedules, me dedico a compartir, I spend time, entre mis pasatiempos favoritos, among my favorite hobbies, quisiera poder lograr, I would like to be able to achieve, diferente faceta, different facets, querer superarse, want to improve oneself. Notice how rather than just writing down one word, we write them in phrases. This provides context to help us recall the words in the future. Now, most students, they make the mistake of trying to memorize single word lists, which is extremely difficult if you don't have other context to tie that word to. So we solve that problem by writing down the word that we want to remember in a phrase. So instead of just writing down, for example, pasatiempo for hobby, for the word hobby, we write entre mis pasatiempos favoritos. This adds a little extra context to the word. And then if you write in your journal that today you studied the video with Hector talking about himself, then you tie that contextual information to the other words and you can easily remember what pasatiempo means. So in the future, when you are studying Spanish and you need to remember a word, be sure to write it in the phrase that you found it. Keep in mind, you don't have to write the entire sentence. Please don't do that. Just a few words before and maybe after to help you remember the context. This is also important because twice Hector uses the word compartir. So one sentence he says, me dedico a compartir con mi familia. In this sentence, me dedico a compartir means I spend time. But then he says, algo adicional que quiero compartir con ustedes. In this sentence, compartir means to share. So by writing words and phrases, you can remember how to use them and how you can use the same word to mean different things. All right, so great work today. If you're looking to really level up your Spanish, click the first link that I have pinned in the comments for you to get instant access to my free guide called The 3 Secrets to Learn Spanish Faster. And if you want to learn more about Puerto Rican Spanish, click this little button right here. That'll take you directly to our Puerto Rican Spanish playlist here on YouTube. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel by clicking this little monkey right here. Nos vemos.